everybody, it's Mrs. Pound. We are studying Chapter 19 on ecology from BJU Biology's 4th edition. And today we're starting section 19b on the biosphere. So let's take a look at subsection 19.3 on interactions in the biosphere. Our objectives today will be to describe and contrast the concepts of habitat and niche, define and give examples of limiting factors, and use examples to demonstrate the difference between density-dependent and density-independent factors. So when I talk about the biosphere, I'm talking about the part of the Earth in which life can exist. And so we have the Earth, and there is an area on the Earth where life can exist. It's everywhere in the ocean where there is life, it's everywhere on land where there is life, and it's everywhere in the air where there is life. So where there is life, that's included in the biosphere. Bio meaning living, and sphere, the sphere around the Earth. Now, every living organism has a habitat. This is where an organism lives, or the address of an organism. So here we have a habitat, and it looks like there's some water here and grass and some shrubs and trees. This looks like a very nice habitat. So the habitat includes all of the living and the non-living things that are in that area for an organism. Each organism also has a niche. This is what an organism does, including its relationship to and effect on its habitat, its role. So here we have a fox, and part of that fox's role is to, say, kill mice, kill and eat mice, as you can see it eating, or whatever it eats in its environment is part of its role. And so all of its interactions there. And another example is the niche of an adult leopard frog is that it consumes insects and is prey for snakes, birds, and raccoons. Also, part of its niche is where it can live, the certain temperatures, the fact that it does need water. All of those things are also part of its niche. And there might be other frogs in the area, but perhaps they eat in different areas, so they have different niches. Also, in trees, there can be 3 different warblers that live in a tree, and they all eat the same thing, but the 3 different species occupy different parts of the tree. One species eats insects from the top, one from the middle, and one from the bottom, and so that's how they occupy different niches. Even though they appear to have the same niche, they do have slightly different niches. Now, everything needs energy, and energy in ecosystems is non-cyclic. There has to be a constant input of energy. That's why if the sun were to go out and photosynthesis were to stop, we would be in trouble because energy cannot be recycled. It must be constantly put into the system. Once energy is used, it is gone. Matter, on the other hand, is cyclic in the biosphere. It is actually recycled, and decomposers are important in a lot of those cycles. Now, we call these cycles biogeochemical cycles, and a biogeochemical cycle is the movement of a particular chemical substance through the Earth's system. So a couple of those biogeochemical cycles are the nitrogen cycle and the carbon and oxygen cycle. Now, we've talked about the carbon and oxygen cycle before. That's where we have photosynthesis and respiration and the interaction there. But the one we have not talked about is the nitrogen cycle. And the nitrogen cycle is very important for the ability to make proteins in organisms. And the most abundant gas in the atmosphere is nitrogen, so it's very abundant. But this is not a usable form for life. So nitrogen fixation must happen, and this is a process in which certain bacteria capture atmospheric nitrogen and convert it to the stored nitrogen compounds. So this is the root of a soybean plant, and you can see right here there's a nodule, and there's a few nodules over here. There are nodules on this root, some right here, that contain bacteria that will fix nitrogen into a form that is usable by plants, animals, and everything else by living things. So that is important. We'll go more in depth on the nitrogen cycle in class. In the biosphere, there are also what we call limiting factors. This is something that in some way restricts the growth or existence of an organism. These are essential materials for growth and reproduction, such as food. Food can be a limiting factor. Is there enough food in the area to support the population? Some limiting factors on plant growth are amounts of sunlight, water, and nutrients in the soil. Different plants require different amounts of sunlight, also water. Some grow in places where there's a lot of water, some grow where it's very dry. And nutrients in the soil, different plants require different amounts of nutrients. Limiting factors do affect one another. Okay, so for instance, if a seed falls in an area where there's enough sunlight but there's not enough water, it will not grow. So that is how they affect one another. In a drought, some plants die, but others do not because their range of tolerance for water is different. So you can see this very parched soil here, not growing much, but these shrubs are growing in the background. So they must have a higher tolerance for very little water, where all of the other plants that once grew in this area, their tolerance for water was much lower, and so they could not grow when it became very dry. So tolerance range can affect that. Some limiting factors are density dependent. And this is a particular measure of the environment that becomes more limiting as a population increases. So we can see some cows grazing here. But maybe if we increase the number of cows, then there would not be enough pasture, there would not be enough food for them. So that would be a density dependent factor. And some examples are lack of food due to overgrazing. So there are only a certain amount of animals that can graze on a land before animals will start to starve. And lack of suitable trees for woodpecker nesting cavities. There are only so many trees in a forest that have a hole where a woodpecker can nest. And so the number of woodpeckers depends upon the number of those holes in trees. Now, another type of limiting factor is a density independent factor, and this is a particular measure of the environment that limits population growth regardless of the size of the population. So it doesn't matter how big the population is, this will limit the growth of that population. And some examples are hurricanes, extreme temperatures, and drought. If there is a sudden hurricane, that population will decrease because there's devastation. If there's an extreme temperature change or a drop again, all of the individuals will be affected by these things. When we're talking about populations, when they first start to grow, there tends to be exponential growth. This is the rate of population growth in which the population size multiplies at a constant rate and regular intervals. Say if an organism goes into a new environment where there were lots of resources, its population will grow exponentially and just seem to start out gradually and then skyrocket. We can see this with human population growth. We can see this when we start to grow bacteria. We can see this when we introduce an exotic species into an area. However, there is something called carrying capacity. This is the maximum population size that a given area can sustain. After a while, the population will level off. When those limiting factors start to come in effect, when they start to exhaust their resources, or the resources will actually cap the population at the carrying capacity. And so these flamingos, there's a lot of flamingos here, so that is probably their carrying capacity for this environment. So this is a graph of carrying capacity, and carrying capacity is labeled right here. We can see the exponential growth. So right here where this line is going up, draw a line to that and write exponential growth, because you can see that it shoots up, and it actually overshot the carrying capacity. So at this point, organisms start to die, maybe due to starvation or lack of another resource. So they die and they dip below the carrying capacity. But now they're below the carrying capacity and the environment can hold more. So births will outnumber deaths, and it will go just a little bit over the carrying capacity, and there will be this back and forth. So it will never just level right off at the carrying capacity, but there will be this up and down that the average is the carrying capacity. And so this average is the carrying capacity, how many organisms can be carried by that environment and can live there with those particular limiting factors, be they density dependent or density independent. A lot of times it's more the density dependent because it depends upon the number. That's why it fluctuates up and down here. So our objectives today were to describe and contrast the concepts of habitat and niche, to define and give examples of limiting factors, and use examples to demonstrate the difference between density dependent and density independent factors. So don't forget your 5 questions in your notes and keep watching this video to answer the questions at the end.